Alright, I hope you guys are ready for this because it's about to be a long one. To begin, I wanted this to be a wearable piece, and as it would have 2 wings on it on either side of my body, I figured a backpack would be the easiest solution. I thrifted a kid's backpack and cut it all apart with the worst scissors I could possibly imagine, at least for this project. There we go! Until it was just the back piece and straps. I had sourced and cut down a 1/2-inch piece of plywood that I would be screwing to the back piece around the front of it, if that makes sense, to give the wings something more sturdy to hold on to. I believe I used 5 very tiny but mighty screws for this one in each corner and then 1 in the top middle, as I knew that would be taking on the grunt of the weight. Put it on and decided where I wanted the wings to actually come out from, referencing multiple photos of the ones that I was recreating. More on that in the next video. Once I figured it out, I simply marked it out as best as I could with literally just like a pencil crayon. Right there. About, I'm gonna say 3¼ inches down. And I measured how far down that marking actually was, which I think was about 3¼ 3½ inches. Put a line all the way across to signify where I would be putting the PVC pipe. I measured the PVC pipe to actually determine the middle of it, as I want both wings to be pretty much the exact same size and shape. And I did the same markings on the piece of wood, so no matter what, I knew that the lines would match up. To actually make them be able to move, I'm using black shoelaces that I got from the dollar store. That was like magic. It's alive! Okay, hopefully I can do this with just this. And now to make the pipe actually malleable, I'm going to be heating it up, which is not a new concept at all, although I will be doing it with a blow dryer, not a heat gun. Which does take a little bit longer, but it's a hell of a lot less expensive, plus most people already have one lying around. For most of the hairdryer process, I'm using it to heat up an area for maybe about 20 seconds and using these clamps to squish it as much as possible. Multiple clamps. This is being done in the center, which I marked out and outwards until I get a little bit further than where the wood piece would end. Basically just flatten it so it sits as flat as possible on my back. Then as it cascades out on both sides, I'm using the blow dryer again for maybe about 30 seconds on each, as I won't be flattening these but rather shaping them upward. Without flattening them, hopefully. Doing my best at least. This did take multiple tries and unfortunately it did bend in some areas, but as long as you're still able to fit the laces through, which will be a later on Sara problem, you're all good. Now this structure is, as I stated, going to be how it attaches to your back, and then the solid part of the wing. The portion that will actually be moving up and down, that part comes next with an entirely different piece of PVC pipe. For this I messed around with the measuring tape off camera, while again referencing multiple photos to decide how big I wanted to make this wing. Then I cut my PVC pipe down to the necessary size for me. twice, one for each side, and then technically a third time because I had to cut off the excess. My next step was making the place for them to properly attach to without much resistance. To do this, I marked a few inches down, 3 inches I believe, though I do end up changing this later on, but I digress, and then about 1.5 inches on both sides of that 3-inch marking. Heating that up and clamping it the same way as I did before. I needed to create a hole in the piece, eventually both, and I simply did that with a drill, right into the middle marking that I made. That's a mouthful. Being sure the screws that I got would actually fit with a dry fit. Now for the other piece, which connects to my back, I'm using the PVC pipe that I just created to determine how far up and down the rested wings would be. Making a marking on both sides, and then placing the actual wing piece on the top to determine the thickness I had to cut out. I hope that makes sense. It left me with a few inches to cut into on both sides and both wings. I cut it out with some tin snips and then sanded on the edges just a bit to avoid further resistance. I placed a piece that I previously drilled a hole into the piece I just cut from, and decided where it would need to sit to actually sit properly. And then I drilled a hole into the second one as well. Then it was just having to actually get my screw through the first hole, line up the second one, get it through that, and then the third one, and then line up the last. This was done loosely at first, and then I added a washer and then a nut to the other side to keep it secure, but make sure it still has enough for the articulation to actually occur. And there you have it, sports fans. As my dad would say, the structure of your wing or wings. If you are looking for something similar but just one way and not a full-on contraption on your back, I will leave a link to one below. It's by a creator named Random Tuesday. Anyways, I digress. You could stop here if this was big enough for your project and just continue on with like the fabric and whatnot of it, but mine needed to be much larger and skinnier. I drilled 2 holes into the end of the actual wing piece and measured out the thickest wire I owned to be the last of the wing. It was really big, guys. To give it more stability, I added it through the holes that I made, pulled it in half, and then placed the 2 halves actually into my drill hole, and then I turned it on. You could do this by hand, but I found it a lot easier to do usually this way, so I've never twisted my wire with this length, so I ran into a few issues, but they were fixable. Oh my god. I mean, it didn't work like I planned, but it kind of worked. I bent the wire to shape it a little bit more to the ending shape that I wanted it to be. And then used my blow dryer and clamps once again to flatten the end of the PVC piping. It was only after the ends were flattened that I drilled the final hole for some wire reinforcements. Which were really only wire wrapped around the first handful of inches of the original wiring coming out. As wire would be very difficult to properly wrap fabric around and hold its shape alone, I used what I considered to be a minimal amount of thermoplastic or Warbleed. To wrap around both the end of the PVC pipe and then the entire wire wing that I had just made. cutting off excess as needed, and then adding that onto the parts that actually did need it. Before I continued with all of the pieces in the places that they needed to be, I wanted to make sure that I could actually get the laces through and through, as I had to go from one side to the other. There was a few more moving parts, literally. Yeah! I mean, you didn't really see that, but yeah! I created another hole and tied it in a knot. My original idea for the actual wing portion was to make it all umbrellas, which may sound weird, but it made sense in my head. All secondhand umbrellas to which I would place them together and use their hardware as the boning. A good idea, but poor execution. I also reminded myself that I would need a place in the middle to pull the lava crunk, aka the laces, so I needed to make a hole which proved to be fairly difficult in itself. Ow! I ended up using a smaller bit to make the hole and using a little bit of a bigger bit to make the hole bigger. It's really hard to drill into a cylinder. To make the laces stay in place, or shall I say laces stay in their places, I use these toggle stoppers. And I was needing to fix one end because I cut into a piece I shouldn't have, but it was easier than I thought. I simply hot glued it and it worked. Side quest completed. Finally, it was time to fabric them for the actual wing. Taking a thrifted curtain, placing it down, and then placing the wing piece down as well. I had to determine where exactly to cut. I needed enough slack that there would be coverage around the top, the side, both of the corners, and the bottom down a little bit. I also knew that I wanted a disconnect from the wing piece, so if I ever wanted or needed to, I could simply take it off and wash it or whatever. So I pinned around 3/4 of the top. This might actually have to be where I stop with the umbrella specifically. Unfortunately, I did not take into account that they all come from one piece. I think I'm just gonna leave it here and sew it like that. Being sure to get the umbrella piece in there as well. Okay, so 2 things. 1, don't do this indoors. I'm not a professional. I'm just stupid sometimes. Also, wear eye protection, indoors or outdoors. 3rd thing, if you are doing this indoors, which you should not be, make sure you're not doing this towards anything that's flammable. 4th thing, make sure your fan's on so you got airflow, but also doors shut so your neighbors can't hear what you're doing. I went back and forth with how I was going to make this detachable. I thought about a zipper, buttons, but I thought the most practical and easy option would be snap-on fasteners. I'll save you most of the footage from these, as these particular ones had a learning curve to them, and there was literally hours of footage for this alone, and there are so many steps. But basically we had the fixed portion of the wing that was the back piece, then the wing itself that can now open and close alongside the fabric that will eventually have more shape to it. But I'm getting ahead of myself. It's got some quote-unquote extra fabric around the top, which I've sewed it down partially, and then the extra fabric around the corners and back that I will be pulling that extra fabric over fairly taut up until the actual articulating pieces, which for obvious reasons, like, I don't know, movement, I will be leaving fairly loose. And then adding the fasteners. Maybe about 12 altogether? Really going back here on how the heck I was going to get all these sides together without actually being able to sew them, because I wanted to be able to remove this if necessary. And then I realized that I can put buttons on them, so they literally can just, I have two hands at least. Huzzah! Breakaway. I mean, yes, it's an eyesore, but painted black from far enough away, probably won't even realize it. As for the aforementioned boning from earlier, I needed to figure out where that would be going. Basically, I needed to figure out the shape-ish, and then where the corner would connect with the, let's call it skin, which is funny and fitting if you're catching on to my character yet. I already knew where the channels would be installed in my umbrella, as the umbrella already had channels of their own, which I cut out in accordance to those. So I use them as a template to add the boning channels. I just pinched a section of fabric, and in the region of the umbrella, I made sure that the pinched section had both the umbrella and the underlying fabric to it, so it would be a seamless transition. And I put a pin in it. A lot of pins. I did that 3 times, then used a meter stick to determine where those went straight out from, and then use that as a guide in the meantime. I'm not going to bore you again with the sewing of this either, not because I don't have the footage, but because I looked over the footage and honestly it's very hard to tell the difference between all the different blacks that are included in this, and what the heck I'm even doing. But I promise you I sewed all along the necessary and pre-planned out seams that we went over. So I could use chalk to determine what the shape of the wing would actually be. And then I cut out the shape along the chalk lines. Now that I had the shape and the boning channels, it was time to do some boning. That's what she said. I was originally going to use the hardware from the umbrellas, but that was a no-go. So I basically just used the rest of the wiring that I had already used before and fed it through the channels. I went one step further with these, as I would also, as I said, want them to be removable if the case came where I actually wanted to wash this piece or something once again. So I didn't glue them in. I used the end piece from my umbrella. I sewed along the outside where the metal first goes into the boning channel. I sewed around that a few times just to keep it as secure as possible. And then I used the end pieces from my umbrella originally and sewed around the end of those as well, because they had a hole that I could actually get into. And then put the hole that I hadn't sewn into on top of the wire. So it was secure, but not permanent. And there we go. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I hope it was easy enough to watch and hear. And I'll see you in the next one. Bye guys. Happy Halloween.